Okay, listen up. Say it again.
Statement of the opinion, will, or intent of the body.
Okay? A statement of a body. Which body is making a statement by making these resolutions? Virginia legislature or assembly. And what do you think they're stating in their resolution? Go ahead. They're against what? Very good. So the Virginia legislature adopted a set of resolutions that basically summarize the American case against the Townsend Acts. And a resolution's got to begin with an opening statement, right? Guess who made the opening statement in this particular resolution? Name you've heard of that you're going to hear a lot about in the next few test materials. Very good. George Washington. Very good. Very good. So the resolutions began with a statement from George Washington. And basically what Washington said in his opening statement was that only colonial legislatures had the right to levy taxes on the colonists. He did not believe that the British Parliament could levy taxes because that was taxation without representation. Okay? So again, these resolutions that were adopted by the Virginia Assembly began with a statement from George Washington, because he was from Virginia, and he basically stated that only colonial legislatures had the right to levy taxes on the colonists. The Parliament did not, because that was taxation without representation. Now, what happened after the Stamp Act was repealed on the part of the colonial merchants? Anybody? Okay, so they got rid of the non-importation acts. Well, guess what they did to show their resentment to the Townsend Acts? Done did it again. Thanks for coming. They reissued those again. They reissued them again because they worked so well the first time, did they not? They did. So another thing that happened is these colonial merchants signed new non-importation agreements, which stated again that they would not import or buy British goods. Stated again. And the reason they did it is because the philosophy worked so well with the Stamp Act. And they believed that it'll be just as effective in the case of the Townsend Acts. Now that was the nice people. Now we're going to get back to the Soraya Durants of this world. This is what they did that maybe wasn't so nice. That halo overhead is tainted today. Okay, here's some things that other colonists did to show that they were upset with the Townsend Acts. But what are they really upset the most with? Search warrants, writs of assistance. Okay, so some Americans even went farther. One, mobs poured into the streets. Mobs even boarded and smashed up British ships. They poured into the streets. They boarded and smashed up and destroyed British ships. They attacked British custom officials. They attacked British custom officials. So mobs poured into the streets. Mobs boarded and smashed British ships. Mobs attacked the British custom officials. Guess what else they did, Soraya? Your favorite thing.
They tarred and feathered.
Thank you. They tarred and feathered anyone who would give any information on smugglers. You remember they were giving people that would rat out their neighbors rewards, right? So these mobs, if they found anybody that was leaking information on smugglers, they tarred and feathered them. They even went as far to go to name calling. Yes, they went to name. In Boston, Massachusetts, these mobs who were being watched pretty heavily by what? British soldiers started calling them names. Lobsters. That's where the term redcoats came from, actually. They started calling them lobsters, redcoats, and bloody backs. So they began the name-calling game. They didn't believe in sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. So they started referring to these British officers and soldiers as lobsters, redcoats, and bloody backs. See, name calling goes way back. Way back. Yes?
So the British government at this point doesn't think, man, what if we just have the states levy the taxes and still have them come to us?
Hadn't come to their mind yet.
Wow.
That'd be too much. Anyway, and this is what, hey, this has started more than one riot. Yes.
The third thing that you said.
They poured into the streets, they boarded and smashed British ships, they attacked British custom officials. They tarred and feathered anyone who informed on smugglers. They even started calling them names. Now, this has actually started some of the biggest riots in America, even way many years after. The colonists started to throw stones and snowballs at the soldiers. You ever heard of the Watts riot, Rodney King, in the 80s? Started by the same type of thing. The Watts riots in the 60s started by the same type of thing. So the colonists would even throw stones and snowballs at the soldiers. And every month, friction between the colonists and the soldiers became more and more intense, which eventually led to one of the more infamous incidents in American history, also known as the Boston Massacre. What's going on? Anything or just
No, I'm just sitting here hoping I'll learn something.
Well, you might. You're going to learn Strive Durant. She knows how to tar and feather somebody. I'll tell you that.
That's not good.
No. Okay, let's move on to the Boston Massacre. Okay, some of you probably know something about this, so we'll maybe see what you know. On March 5th, 1770, March 5th, 1770, a large crowd or mob gathered in Boston around British soldiers that represented the 29th British Regiment. Okay, on March 5th, 1770, a large mob gathered in Boston, Massachusetts, and they gathered around soldiers of the 29th British Regiment. March 5th, 1770, large mob, as we've talked about, gathered in Boston around a bunch of soldiers of the 29th British Regiment. And they started yelling their insults, redcoats, lobsters, bloody backs, started throwing snowballs at the soldiers. Not rocks, snowballs. This is why we have a snowball policy here.
Yeah, thanks.
Because these things can get out of hand.
Thanks, rebels.
Yeah. Now, even though we talked about this, this probably happened many times, where a mob of colonists gathered around a group of soldiers and began to throw insults at them, began to throw snowballs at them. Well, this time, matters got out of hand. The mob pressed closer and closer toward the soldiers, and someone, to this day, we still don't know, gave the order to fire. Okay? So, this mob of American colonists just pushed closer and closer and closer to these British soldiers. They continued to throw snowballs. And finally, somebody got tired of it. The order to fire came out. Now, during this firing, 3 Colonial civilians were killed and 2 others were mortally wounded. 3 were killed and 2 were mortally wounded.
What does that mean?
That's my next question. See, she's all over. What does that mean, Keller? If you would do this, okay, because you're kind of that outdoorsy guy. You're going out and you get yourself a big bull elk. Well, you shoot your elk, and I mean that thing drops, and it's just heart shot, done, killed. Blaine's with you. He sees another bull elk. He shoots his, doesn't quite, he wounds it. And then he can't find it. But that elk goes off and sets down and dies. That means you're mortally wounded. You're wounded and it's a mortal wound and you die from it. So, when we talk about battles and stuff, and we're going to go through this from now clear through the Vietnam War and more, if you hear casualties and you're KIA, killed in action, that means they're killed immediately. If they are wounded, they're wounded. If they're casualties, they're wounded. If they're mortally wounded, they are wounded and die from the wounds. So 5 people actually were killed, civilians, in this Boston Massacre. 5. One of those just happened to be a guy by the name of Crispus Attucks, who's on your ID sheet. One of the victims of the Boston Massacre was Crispus Attucks. And this was kind of sad in a way because he was a former slave. Former slave. So one of the casualties, deaths, in this Boston massacre was Crispus Attucks, a former slave. Now this is kind of sad because he actually had escaped from his master 20 years earlier. He had served 20 years, not served, but he had been 20 years a free slave. Now he didn't have all the rights of white people, right? But he was a free slave. He had no master. So for 20 years he was free as a slave. And ironically, he is among the first to die over this struggle of colonial freedom between Great Britain and the American colonies. He's going to be one of the first casualties of American independence, the American Revolution, although we haven't got any battles. A former slave, free 20 years, ironically is going to be one of the first casualties of what we're going to consider our movement towards independence, our fight to independence, the American Revolution and such. Okay? Now, obviously news of this shooting spread across all 13 colonies, and the people of Boston in general went wild with anger. They thought this was a massacre, and they demanded after this that all British troops be withdrawn from the city. So when the news got out of this shooting, which they termed as a massacre, thus the name Boston Massacre, the citizens of Boston demanded that all British troops be withdrawn from their city.
Was it just in Boston that they wanted them removed?
Yes. Now that's probably not going to happen. They're not going to withdraw all the soldiers out of there, are they? But what might the British Parliament do to cool tempers a bit? What might they do?
Undercover. Maybe like,
What?
take some axe out.
Take some what?
Or kill some axe or something.
No, that'd be, think about the event.
Hire the soldiers.
Close.
Get rid of the soldiers.
Put the soldiers on trial.
Put the ones on trial that shot the people. Very good. So what happened is some passions cooled somewhat when the British government put the British soldiers on trial for murder that were responsible for the deaths of those 5 people. So they sorted out who fired, who didn't fire to a point, and they put some British soldiers on trial for murder. Now, ironically, they were defended by American colonists in the trial. They didn't send somebody over from Britain to defend them. Okay? They hired colonial lawyers to defend these soldiers. And the 2 lawyers hired were Josiah Quincy Jr. and John Adams. So the 2 attorneys or lawyers that were appointed to those soldiers to defend them in their murder trial were Josiah Quincy Jr. and John Adams. They are going to defend these soldiers. John Adams ring a bell? He'll go on to be President of the United States. Now, what's your first thought of that? Think about it. What's your first thought? Does that surprise you that a future president would try these murderous redcoats? Well, this is why. Why did he do it? Neither one of the men had any sympathy for the soldiers. Neither Quincy or Adams, the two defense attorneys, had any sympathy for these soldiers. But why did they represent them?
Money.
No?
Fairness.
They thought they should be entitled to a fair trial, just like everybody else, which shows some admirable qualities. So even though they didn't particularly like them, or they didn't believe what they did was right, or they didn't absolutely have any sympathy for them, both believed that these men should have a fair trial. That's what America's about. Yeah.
I think the jury was also calling this.
Sure they were.
Oh man, they were having a rough time, I bet.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Here's the thing. That's my thought exactly, but here's the thing. They tried several soldiers. All but 2 were acquitted. All but 2 of the soldiers were acquitted. What does acquitted mean?
All the charges.
Charges were dropped or they were found innocent. Okay? So all but 2 were acquitted. And the 2 that were found guilty were convicted of manslaughter. The 2 that were found guilty were convicted of manslaughter. But the fact is, they were released a short time later. Now, you might think, well, that's really ridiculous. Point is, I think on the colonist part, is they actually took time to prosecute them.
How do 5 people get killed?
All right, what I'm gonna say to you is, have you ever shot more than 1 deer in your life in the same year?
Not with us, yeah, not with it.
Huh?
Not with a muzzle loader.
Hey, he's got a point. That's a good question. How could 2 people shoot five people? Really, the point is, several were involved. Two took the heat, right? You always gotta have somebody be the example. Those 2 became the example. But Blaine makes a great point. What makes you, he's got a great point. How could that happen? Doesn't make any sense. Well, 2 were found guilty, but they were what? Shortly released, shortly afterwards.
No one really got punished.
No, yeah, but the point is, the colonists were a little bit more happy about it in Boston because at least they tried him. Okay, found him guilty, and I think Blaine makes a good point. They, they said, hey, that's not even possible, so we'll put him through it, we'll jail him a while, we'll let him go. Okay, when we come back on tomorrow, let's talk a little bit about this, but our next lecture will be the Townsend Acts being repealed. Okay? And you're going to find it ironic that some of the reasons why they're repealed were the same as the Stamp Act.